to have it be a non-disturbance buffer because normally you can do grading and earth-moving operations within a buffer and go back and replant new vegetation. We thought it would be a better solution for this site to have that be a non-disturbance zone, and then you start the grading once you get outside of that buffer area. And so the intent, like Stuart was showing earlier, is we're going to grade the site down to lower the buildings down below the road location for Eagle Lake Drive so that they have a less visual impact. We think that that's more valuable than, you know, just having the buildings up at the same grade. It's worth keeping in mind also that the site on probably 75% of it has the 100-foot buffer. So there's more, you know, the total acreage that's set aside for the buffer is way more than the 10 acres or 5 acres that Stuart was referring to earlier. We can get you additional information on that.
May I, Madam Mayor?
I think you were asking,
Sure.
Ms. Keplinger, what is an ordinary buffer?
Yes.
This is a unique situation. The ordinance, as Matt said, is on a sliding scale. From 1 to 10 acres, it goes from a few feet all the way up to 100 feet. So any site that is over 10 acres has a 100-foot buffer if it's industrial next to residential. What staff is suggesting in our recommendation is that that buffer needs to be increased. This is 168 acres, and we feel like that buffer should be at least increased to 150 feet.
Okay.
All right.
Just one more, Madam Mayor. So the question for the petitioner, I think you answered the buffer question, but I'm trying to understand from what you are trying to do to meet your objectives. By increasing the buffer, does it limit you from meeting your objectives?
As we've gone through this process, and you know, you start with 168 acres, then you set aside the swim buffer down along Coffee Creek. You set aside the buffers around the perimeter, take the right-of-way dedication that is required along Shopton Road from Charlotte DOT. You take the right-of-way dedication for the future extension of Shopton Road through the site. The additional buffer dedication that the airport's proposed up at the north end of the site to protect the only houses that are up on that road. And then you look at the topography and anticipating where you have slopes and water quality, and then you net out of it, all that is the remaining developable footprint for an industrial developer to come in, and so they look at a smaller and smaller circle. And then when you look at the road improvements that the airport's committed to, which I think was 8 turn lanes, you know, that goes on to the bottom end of the financial performance of the project. And so the project reaches a point where the economics eat up the land price, and it doesn't work.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. While I thank you for explaining the economic side of this project, but as a passionate advocate for the environment and as a chair of the Environment Committee, I am quite concerned about the wildlife there and the trees, preserving our tree canopy and so on. So I'll probably be visiting the site. Thank you.
I have Mr. Bakari.
Thank you. So I mean, I've got 2 items that I just want to kind of relay. Maybe there's a question in there that either confused or concerned me about this. The first one specifically around your response, petitioner, on why the purchase of the neighborhood doesn't make sense now from your perspective. Citing the noise contours and the FAA response there doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, because while those noise contours may have changed, this statement in the area plan doesn't seem to be an FAA-driven federal legislation, you know, factor. It has to do with the fact that the neighborhood needs to be bought as a whole by either the airport or a private developer. So whether the airport is able through FAA or not to purchase it doesn't seem like a real relevant argument to me as to why And that goes to the second point, which is even more concerning, to be honest, and it builds off what Councilman Phipps was saying earlier, is we see staff recommendations, even today in a microcosm, a little bit all over the place. And I know it's your opinion, but it's your, as you would state, your opinion based on the existing policy that's in place. The existing policy here clearly states, not is the neighborhood willing to sell, it just says word for word, if it's bought, right? So in my opinion, one, I really would strongly urge us to adjust our opinions based more on the plans and policies that are in existence today, because that one felt way more like an opinion. And two, as we're going into the next month of work on this, that all feels to me like these neighbors are in the driver's seat here. Our stated policy says this shouldn't be developed at all in any way unless they're bought out. So if they're willing to negotiate at this point and say, you know, we're willing to do it with 3 times the buffer that they're proposing today, I would feel that that's something that they're in the driver's seat, given the fact that we would be making a decision inconsistent with existing policy if we did it. So I would urge you to strongly consider that over the next month.
Dr. Harlow?
Thank you. Thanks, Mayor. This is a good thing, as much as we're debating and asking questions about it. The reality is that neighbors have said, hey, we're not really against this. We just really want a little more of a buffer, and we appreciate the literature you've provided for us here. And thank you also for answering Ms. Asmir's questions and explaining a little bit of the economics around why or why not. You know, you can do more buffer or not in no build zones and stuff. It just seems that on such a large site, with so much acreage, and I, like most of my colleagues, I didn't even know this existed. So cool for making this a secret neighborhood for you guys. But you know, 100 is the minimum by ordinance. 150 is the recommendation. The community wants 300. There just seems that if you guys have been so amenable all of this way, there's got to be a little bit more middle there. And I don't know what it takes from a topography standpoint. You spoke a little bit about land cost and stuff. I'm not so sensitive to that fact, that the cost of what it takes to build on maybe a little more expensive land because of topography. I'm concerned more about the environment, and then also it actually just seems like we're much closer than we're maybe making it seem here. So therefore, if there's, maybe we don't get 300, maybe we don't get 150 either, but let's do the math and maybe find a way. I'm just going to charge us to do that. We have a lot of contentious ones, and a lot of times we see the vote no's. This is saying, hey, vote yeah, but just give us a little more wiggle room. I'm just saying, come on, let's you got a month to do it. Let's make it work. And from a staff standpoint, I'm not always necessarily in favor of staff's recommendations based on plans and things, but this one is very clear when it comes to the policy. This one is very direct. Whether it, we don't see a lot that says, hey, neighborhoods must be bought out for this scenario, and yet staff's still recommending that. And the neighborhood seems to be okay with it, and with the project as a whole. So I just think there's a little more discussions that definitely need to be had here. I'm sure there's a way to make it work with just a little more buffer. And I like to think that these neighbors maybe, it's a negotiating thing, right? We asked for 300, and they're okay with something less than that. And I think you may be okay with something a little more than the 160 as well, 150. So I just urge you to have.
You're going to have to go to work for kind of a negotiation board at some point, Dr. Harlow. We have Ms. Mayfield.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and I want to thank my colleagues for their comments regarding this discussion on this petition, and for the residents that gave us the opportunity for us to meet along with staff. I will say that I'm disappointed in the fact that I missed the language regarding the 1996 proposal stating that the area needed to be purchased before any development. So I'm not sure how I missed that in our conversations and in our meeting, that we had that language in place. I will also say I have concerns regarding the last meeting that we held. I was under the impression that on our end, since this is government that's looking to do this development, that we would identify an opportunity to go, if not the 300, further than the 150 that was discussed. It would be helpful if our team up top can pull back up the page that the residents had regarding the flag and how close the flag was noted in the buffer, because I would like to hear, Mr. Hare, from you all at proximity, because that does show some concern. I think it's back another 2 or 3
That was it.
where you saw the actual flag from the community. Yeah, keep going back. That one. So I'm trying to get a better picture, because we drove out to the facility so that my colleagues know. We went out and viewed the facility. There is a giant, basically the power lines for a plant right in the middle of the land, so that breaks it up. But I would like, Mr. Hare, for you to share, do you know where that flag is hanging?
I don't, I'm sorry.
So I'm gonna ask for one of the petitioners to come back down to one of the residents, to come back down. Mr. Rondo, if you would give me an idea again where this location is from inside the gate.
Just to clarify, the flag marks the start of the buffer. There is a horizontal band in the background that's a little lower down. That horizontal band is literally surveyor's tape run along the far edge of the buffer at that location. And you can see, even though it's small in this photo, you can clearly see that would be, as far.
So let me get clarification. Where the flag is noted, that's the start of the 50 feet, which was initially what was talked about, but what we're talking about today is 150 feet. So this is at the very beginning of the 150 feet.
It's the very beginning of the 100-foot buffer,
Okay.
and then the 50-foot setback would be in addition to the buffer.
So this is at the beginning of the 100-foot buffer. So we don't have anything that's out there that actually shows where 100 feet is, and then where the additional 50 is.
Actually, the horizontal band that he pointed out with the,
Right, that
that
back
that is 100 feet into the woods.
So that's at 100, and then what
And-
was proposed is up to 150
Right.
for staff. Okay, that's one piece. Ms. Keplinger, I'm trying to understand, I have a couple of challenges. One, we're dealing with a 1996 plan, but in that plan, we had very clear language. My colleague asked the question, but I really still didn't hear a definitive answer of why staff will be comfortable moving forward with a proposal when we have language that specifies. And this, in the 7 years that I've been in this role, this is the first time also that I've seen specific language such as this, and I don't know if we have it in any other areas of the city, but I'm really trying to understand how staff became comfortable with this proposal as it is at 150-foot buffer when there's language specifically saying not to sell for anything other than residential unless the entire community is purchased. And according to what was shared, the community could not be purchased today because according to FAA standards, they are no longer in the flight overlay. So it's conflicting language that I'm hoping you can help clarify for me.
I may be able to help with some of it. Although the airport cannot use FAA funds to purchase the property, and I believe that's what Mr. Hare said, that doesn't mean that there could not be another entity that could go in and buy out the Eagle Lake community were they interested. When we started working with this petition, from a staff perspective, I think we saw that a buyout of the community was unlikely. And we hope to be able to work and to help the petitioner and the neighborhood work together to make this a win for both the homeowners in the Eagle Lake community and for the property that the airport owns. The buffer that is required along, or that is provided along Pinecrest and the increase to 150 feet, that's a suggestion. We do have larger buffers throughout the city between residential and industrial properties. We have smaller buffers. That, as you heard some of the members of the community say, is just the last issue that they have not been able to resolve with the petitioner.
Mr. Hare, and again, if I can have assistance with going back to the page that has the actual site plan as far as the 3 buildings on it. And while they're pulling that up, it would be helpful to know, our last meeting was to talk about, and what I was under the impression that we walked away from agreeing upon, is that you all would look to see if there was opportunity for additional buffer space. What was the challenge?
So the challenge there, Councilmember Mayfield, is the increasing the buffer increases when a building could go in, when the site could start to be graded, and so it decreases the ability of the site to be developed. That's where the increase on the setback was come up with, and the 150-foot setback from the buffer was identified as a way to kind of come up with an alternative solution that would allow for greater distance between the building and the residential community, but allow for the development of the site to start at that setback, at that setback edge, at that buffer edge where they intersect.
So if we look at what is up right now, and we see at the top the no builds on, of which that is the area where I'm thinking, based on our last conversation, we were talking about the additional 150 feet to get the 300 is along Pinecrest Drive, that area where we have it. What was the challenge with moving the building that we have identified right now over to the other side?
That gets into the swim buffers.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah, that gets into the swim buffers for Coffee Creek and has to be buffered to protect the water quality there. Do you remember how wide the swim buffer is in that area?
I think it's 100.
Yeah, it's
So it's
100
100
feet off the
foot.
creek, yes.
So, additional question now, because again, I am going to take responsibility for not catching the language that was in place, because we would have had a different set of questions when we met. If that top half was not developed, what challenge, if any, would that cause? Because ultimately, where the buffer is being requested is on the area closest to the lake and the residential. Whereas when we drove out together and stood along the gravel road leading to the gate, the land that we looked at was all the land going southwest.
Yep.
What would be the challenge if that's what's developed and if the back area was left for green space and or environmental?
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable question, Councilmember Mayfield, and we're going to work with our consultant team to get that exact answer and get the data on that.